However, as you know, we didn't stop at the plum pudding model, which is good because it's a little goofy, so it's nice to move on from that. And move on we did about 10 to 15 years later. Another physicist, Ernest Rutherford, actually put this plum pudding model to test. And he did it through studies that he'd been doing on radiation that was emitting something called alpha particles. So Rutherford, some of you may recognize that name, is a very famous physicist who made a lot of contributions in terms of radioactivity. When he was studying these alpha particles, he was actually the first person to identify the difference between different types of particles that radioactive materials emit. He got this particular material that he was studying, radium bromide, from his good friend Marie Curie, who obviously also was a leader, really the leader in figuring out much of how radioactive materials work. She has 2 Nobel Prizes for her work in radioactive materials. And something that maybe many of you think, which I know I always think when I hear about radioactivity studies in the early 1900s, is, oh my gosh, this sounds really dangerous, right? They're using radium bromide, and this is a pretty dangerous radioactive material. So for those of you that don't know, radium is extremely radioactive, even in the range of radioactivity. And one of the major problems with it is that if it does get in your body, the radium is treated as calcium in your body. So you can imagine what happens is it gets deposited into your bones, which is not the ideal situation after a long day in the lab. So, this is really a pretty dangerous situation. That's always interesting to point out. He got this from Marie Curie. You can imagine they used the Postal Service. I'm not sure how else they would have transferred it to each other. So it really brings up some issues. The first thing I did when I heard this is actually look up to see how, in fact, Ernest Rutherford did die in 1937. And you'll be happy to know it actually wasn't from radiation poisoning or from bone cancer. So that's really good that worked out okay for him. And that he did get to sort of safely at least end his life before the radiation ended it. But it's really interesting, the studies that he did do with radium bromide, and he was studying the alpha particles. And what was known about alpha particles at the time is that they were these charged particles and that they were very heavy. Does anyone know more than what Rutherford knew at the time what alpha particles actually are? Yeah, good. So they're actually helium atoms, helium ions. And this wasn't really important for the studies. It didn't matter that he didn't know what they are, but it's nice to kind of note now that we do know what they were using. And he was doing quite a few studies with them.